There are nights in a woman's life when she lies in bed listening to her children breathe in the darkness, and she knows that no one on this earth is coming to save her. For Helga Vogelsang, 43 years old, that night was the 14th of September, 1876. Outside her cabin in Stone Ridge Hollow, the rain was turning to snow 3 weeks earlier than it should have. Inside, her 3 children slept curled together in a single bed, meant for one. And in the pocket of her apron, there were exactly $9. $9 to carry a family of 4 through the coldest winter Montana territory had seen in a decade. Helga stood at the kitchen window with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of water that had gone cold an hour ago. She had not cried at her husband's funeral. She had not cried in the 2 months since. And tonight, watching the snow fall on the tin roof of the cabin that was too small and too broken to hold them through winter, she still could not cry. Something in her had closed after Dietrich's last breath, and she did not know how to open it again. The cabin had been built for a young couple in their first year of marriage, not for a family of 4 who had outgrown every corner of it. The roof leaked in 3 places. The chimney drew poorly. The floor sagged in the southwest corner where the foundation stones had shifted 2 winters ago. Dietrich had meant to fix it. He had meant to build an addition when the spring came. He had meant to do a great many things, and then he had coughed blood into his handkerchief one morning in April. And by July, he was in the ground beside the cottonwood tree where their 4th child lay buried, the one who had come too early in 1873 and never opened her eyes. Helga set the tin cup down on the windowsill. She walked to the bed where her children slept. Annika, 11, lay on her side with her arm thrown protectively across her younger sister. Fritz, 8, slept with his fists clenched, the way he had slept every night since his father died, as though he were fighting something in his dreams that he could not fight in his waking hours. Liesel, 5, slept with her mouth open, one small foot sticking out from under the quilt. Helga tucked it back beneath the covers and stood looking at her children's faces in the dim lamplight. And she understood with a clarity that arrived in her chest, like a stone dropping into water, that the decision she needed to make was not a decision at all. It was an acknowledgement. She walked to the trunk at the foot of the bed, the trunk that had come with her from Germany when she was 21 years old, carrying everything she owned and nothing she would need. She opened it and moved aside the wedding shawl she had never worn twice, the christening gown 3 babies had worn, the pressed flowers from a garden in the Black Forest that had been gone from her life for 22 years. Beneath these things, wrapped in oiled cloth, was her father's notebook. Her father had been a forest worker in the Schwarzwald, a man who knew trees the way other men knew their own names. He had taught her to read wood grain before he taught her to read letters. He had taught her that every material in the natural world had properties, and those properties could be read by anyone patient enough to look. The notebook contained 40 years of his observations, drawings of woven shelters that charcoal burners had used for generations, notes on clay mixtures that resisted freezing, diagrams of arch structures that could be made from green saplings bent and held until they hardened into permanent shape. Her father had died when Helga was 16, and she had carried this notebook across an ocean, and in 22 years of marriage she had never once opened it. She had been a wife. She had been a mother. She had not needed to be her father's daughter. Tonight, she needed to be something else. Annika stirred in the bed and opened her eyes. The girl had her father's quiet watchfulness, a way of looking at things that took their measure before speaking. She saw her mother kneeling at the trunk with the notebook open, and she did not ask what it was. She only asked, in a voice pitched low so as not to wake her siblings, Mama, are you afraid? Helga did not turn around. She did not want her daughter to see her face in that moment. No, she said. There was a silence. Then Annika said, I am. Helga closed the notebook and held it against her chest. I know, meine Liebe. Sleep now. Mama? Yes. We cannot stay here, can we? Helga turned then. Her daughter was sitting up in the bed, her braid falling over one shoulder, her eyes clear in the lamplight. 11 years old and already understanding what it had taken Helga 2 months of staring at broken roofs and drafty walls to admit. No, Helga said. We cannot. Annika nodded once, as though some private calculation had resolved itself, and she lay back down and closed her eyes. Helga stayed kneeling by the trunk until the lamp burned low and the wick began to gutter, and then she rose and blew it out, and lay down on the floor beside the bed, because there was no room in the bed, and she was not willing to move any of her children to make room for herself. She did not sleep. She listened to the snow falling on the tin roof, and she counted 47 days until the first killing freeze, perhaps 60 days until the deep cold settled in and stayed. A Montana winter in a 12 by 12 space required 4 cords of split wood at minimum, and those cords needed to stay dry or they would produce smoke instead of heat. And smoke in a sealed sleeping space killed people as reliably as cold, but more quietly, without the warning of pain. She had seen it happen to a family outside of Hollowmere Creek in the winter of 1874. They had been found in the morning arranged as though sleeping, the fire long gone out, the wood stack outside damp all the way through from a November rain that had frozen into ice before it could drain. The father had been 43. The children had been 9 and 11. Helga Vogelsang was 43. Her children were 11 and 8 and 5. She had no intention of being found arranged as though sleeping. Before dawn, she rose and began to pack. Before I continue this story, I want to ask you something. If you are listening from somewhere warm this morning, would you tell me where you are? Leave a comment below. I want to hear from you. And if this story is already reaching you the way I hope it is, please tap the subscribe button. I have many more stories to tell about women who stood when standing seemed impossible. Now let me continue. Klaus Vogelsang was Helga's brother-in-law, 5 years younger than Dietrich had been, a blacksmith by trade and a cautious man by temperament. He arrived at the cabin at mid-morning with his wife Matilda walking 3 steps behind him, which was the way Matilda always walked behind Klaus in public and the way she rarely walked behind him in private. Matilda was a woman who had 5 children in 11 years of marriage and who understood resources the way a banker understood ledgers. She counted every loaf of bread that entered her house and every spoon that came out. She had come to deliver an offer, and the offer carried a price that was not written in any of the words she was about to speak. Klaus took off his hat when Helga opened the door. "Sister," he said, "we have been talking, Matilda and me. We think you and the children should come stay with us through the winter. It is not right, you being here alone with the roof the way it is." Matilda smiled. The smile did not reach her eyes. "Just until spring, of course. Until we can figure something more permanent. The children will have to share, of course. Our Albrecht can move to the kitchen loft, and the girls can double up." "Thank you," Helga said. "Please come in. I have coffee." They came in. Klaus sat at the table. Matilda remained standing, cataloguing the cabin with her eyes, making small mental notes of which furniture might follow Helga into her home and which would have to be sold. The children were awake now, sitting in the corner. Fritz was glaring at the floor. Annika was watching the adults with her quiet attention. Liesel climbed into Helga's lap as soon as her mother sat down. Helga poured coffee. She let the silence do some of the work for her. Then she said, "Klaus, I appreciate what you have come to say. I truly do. You are a good brother, and Dietrich would be grateful." Klaus looked relieved. Matilda did not. "But," Helga said, "we will not be coming to live with you." Klaus set his cup down. "Sister, I have thought about this through the night, and I have decided that what is best for my children is for us to find our own place. Not a house. Not yet. Something smaller. Something I can manage." Matilda's smile had tightened into something that was no longer a smile. "Helga, with respect, I don't think you understand. Where would you go? You have no money. You have 3 children. You cannot live in the woods like a— I will not live in the woods like anything, Matilda. I will live in a place I build. And my children will live there with me, and they will not grow up as the cousins who eat your bread and take up your beds. They will grow up as their own family, with their own walls, however small those walls may be." Klaus looked at his wife. He looked at Helga. He looked at the floor. And then he spoke, and his voice was low and shamed. "Helga, there is something I must tell you." Matilda's head snapped toward him. "Klaus!" "No," he said. "She has to know. Helga, Dietrich borrowed $40 from me in May, for the medicine. The doctor from Butte. He said he would pay me back when the mine paid him for the ironwork. And then he got worse, and he could not work. And—" Klaus stopped. He could not meet her eyes. "Matilda says I have to ask you for it." The silence in the cabin stretched out long and thin. Matilda's voice, when it came, was controlled and precise, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed this speech and was now delivering it. "We have 5 children of our own, Helga. 5 mouths. We cannot simply forgive $40. It is not about your husband, God rest him. It is about what is fair." Helga looked at Klaus. She saw a man who was ashamed of himself for being here, who was ashamed of himself for having a wife who had sent him to ask this, who was ashamed of himself for not being able to stand up to the woman who counted his bread. And Helga understood something in that moment that she had never fully articulated before. She understood that there were 2 kinds of men in the world. There were men like Dietrich, who had been her partner, who had brought his concerns to her and asked for hers, who had treated marriage as a shared room they both lived in. And there were men like Klaus, who had traded their own voice for the quiet of a house where someone else counted the spoons. She felt no anger at Klaus. She felt something closer to sorrow. 60 days, she said. "Give me 60 days, Klaus. I will have your $40. Helga, 60 days. You have my word." Klaus opened his mouth, then closed it. He nodded once. Matilda made a small sound that might have been satisfaction or might have been disappointment that the negotiation had not been longer. They left a few minutes later. Helga stood in the doorway and watched them walk down the path toward the road, Matilda 3 steps behind Klaus, and she understood that she had just added a second deadline to a winter that already had one she might not survive. She did not panic. She did not sit down. She did what her father had always done when faced with a problem too large to solve in one piece. She broke it into smaller pieces and started with the first one. She called the children to her. Annika came immediately. Fritz came slowly, his fists still in the shape they had been in when he was sleeping. Liesel came running and climbed into her mother's lap. "Children," Helga said, "we are going to build a house." "Where?" Annika asked. "I don't know yet. We are going to go find the place." Fritz looked up. "A real house?" "A small one, a very small one. But a real one, yes. One that is ours." Liesel tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Will Papa live there too?" Helga closed her eyes for a moment. Annika was the one who answered. Papa lives with us wherever we go, Liesel, the 11-year-old said, in a voice she had learned from her mother. He is in our hearts. He is not in any house anymore. Liesel considered this. Then she nodded, as though the matter was settled, and returned her attention to the corner of her mother's apron, which she had begun to chew on. Helga held her children. She held them for a long moment, and she told herself that she would not cry, and she did not cry, because something in her was still closed. But she held them, and when she stood up with the straight back of a woman who had made a decision, and who would now do the work the decision required. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky to the northwest had the clean blue color that meant the weather would hold for a few days. It was enough to start. She took the children and the notebook and the splitting maul that had been her father's, and then Dietrich's, and now was hers, and she walked out toward Stoneridge Hollow Creek to find a place to build a life. The creek ran clear and cold that time of year, the cottonwoods going yellow at the edges, the willow still holding green. Helga walked slowly because Liesel's legs were short, and because Annika was watching the water and naming things in a quiet voice, the way she had always done since she was old enough to talk, and because Fritz was hanging back and kicking stones into the current with more force than the stones required. Helga understood that her son was angry. She understood that her son had been angry for 4 months. She understood that he did not know who to be angry at, since the only person he wanted to be angry at was dead. And so he was angry at rocks and doors and his sisters and the sky. She let him kick the stones. She did not tell him to stop. A quarter-mile south of the lumber company's staging area, the canyon narrowed. The north-facing slope on the east side turned steep enough that Helga could calculate from the angle alone how snow would accumulate there in January. Deep, piled against the rock face and packed hard by the prevailing northwest wind, which meant the rock face itself would be largely protected from direct loading, which meant any structure built against it, low enough to stay below the primary wind channel, would shed snow by diversion rather than by resistance. She found the alcove where she had expected it. A rock slide old enough that lichen had colonized most of the exposed surfaces had left a natural hollow in the hillside, semicircular, roughly 11 feet across at the opening, cutting back into the slope perhaps 6 feet at its deepest point. The exposed rock face curved inward with a geometry that was, if not quite deliberate, at least cooperating. Like the inside of a barrel cut in half lengthwise and pressed against the earth. Helga put her palm flat against the back wall and felt nothing move. "Mama," Annika said behind her. "Is this where?" "Yes," Helga said. "It is very small. It will be enough." "Enough for what?" Helga turned to look at her daughter. Annika was standing at the mouth of the alcove with her braid over her shoulder and her hands folded in front of her apron, looking into the hollow the way one might look at a difficult mathematics problem on a slate. "Enough for the winter," Helga said. "Enough to get us to spring. Enough to build something else from." Annika considered this. Then she said, "What is it you are going to build, Mama?" Helga smiled for the first time in a long time. It was a small smile, and tired. But it was a smile. "Annika," she said, "have you ever heard of the charcoal burners of the Black Forest?" "No." "Then sit down. I am going to tell you a story your grandfather told me when I was your age." And so, sitting at the mouth of a rock-slide alcove on a cold afternoon in September of 1876, Helga Vogelsang began to teach her eldest daughter the first lesson her father had ever taught her, which was that the limitations of a material were only limitations if you insisted on using it wrong. Green wood bent without breaking. Seasoned wood held its shape. If you bent green wood into the shape you wanted and held it until it seasoned, it became that shape permanently, as though it had always intended to grow that way. Fritz came closer while she was talking, pretending not to listen, kicking at a small stone near his boot. But he came closer. Liesel sat in her mother's lap and fell asleep against her shoulder. The creek ran behind them, and the sun moved toward the western ridge, and for the first time in 2 months, Helga Vogelsang felt something in her chest that was not quite hope and not quite grief, but occupied the territory between them. She was going to build a woodshed first, she told Annika. Not a house, a woodshed. Because the firewood was what would keep them alive, and the firewood had to stay dry, and dryness was what separated warm sleep from the kind of sleep a family did not wake up from. Once the woodshed was built, she would know she had solved the first problem. Then she would build the shelter. And then, perhaps, by the time the spring came, she would know enough to build something larger. One thing at a time, she said. Your grandfather used to say that. Eine Sache nach der anderen. Eine Sache nach der anderen, Annika repeated, trying the words in her mouth. That is right. They sat in the alcove for another half-hour. Then Helga stood, lifted Liesel onto her hip, took Annika's hand, called Fritz over with a tilt of her head, and they walked back down the path along the creek toward the cabin that would be their home for 8 more days. As they walked, Helga did not look back. She had already seen what she needed to see. The next time she walked up this path, she would be carrying tools. That evening, a man she did not yet know was riding down the road from Hollowmere Creek toward her cabin. His name was Reverend Silas Thornberry, and he had heard through the network of small-town information that moved faster than any telegraph wire that Dietrich Vogelsang's widow was refusing to move in with her husband's brother and was intending to do something foolish. Reverend Thornberry was 48 years old, a lean man with a face that had been shaped more by conviction than by weather. He had been widowed himself 12 years ago, when his wife had died giving birth to a child who had not survived her by more than 3 days. He had buried 3 widows in Hollowmere Creek in his time there. 2 of them had frozen to death in poorly managed shelters. One of them had taken her own life in February of 1872, in a cabin not unlike the one Helga Vogelsang was currently living in. Silas Thornberry was not a cruel man. He was a frightened man, though he would not have used that word. He had learned, over 25 years of ministry, that a widow on the frontier who tried to stand alone was a widow who often did not survive the standing. He had not learned, because no one had ever taught him, that a widow who tried to stand with the wrong kind of help could also fail to survive. The distinction was one his training had not prepared him to make. He arrived at the Vogelsang cabin at dusk. Helga saw him coming down the path and knew who he was before he dismounted. She had seen him preach twice in 2 years. She had not liked him either time, though she would not have been able to say exactly why. Now, watching him tie his horse to the fence rail and approach the door with his hat in his hands, she thought she understood. He was a man who came to widows carrying solutions, and the solutions were always shaped like cages. She opened the door before he knocked. "Mrs. Vogelsang," he said. "Reverend, may I come in? It is cold." She stepped back and let him in. The children were at the table, eating a supper of bread and butter and the last of the preserved plums. They looked up at the stranger. Annika's eyes went to her mother's face and stayed there. Thornberry sat at the table Helga indicated. She poured him coffee. He took off his gloves slowly and folded them on his knee. He looked at the children, and he smiled at them the way a man smiles at children when he does not know how to talk to them, which is to say, carefully. Mrs. Vogelsang, he said, I have come because I heard something that troubled me, and I hope it is not true. What did you hear, Reverend? I heard that you have refused your brother-in-law's offer of shelter. That is true. I heard that you are intending to build something of your own, somewhere on the creek. That is also true. Thornberry looked at her. His eyes were not unkind, which made what he was about to say harder to hear. Mrs. Vogelsang, I have buried 3 widows in this town. One of them froze to death in a cabin she insisted was adequate. One of them was poisoned by the smoke of green wood, because her husband was not there to teach her which wood to burn. One of them I found in February, on a day so cold the tears froze on my face before I could walk back to my horse. I am not telling you this to frighten you. I am telling you this because I do not want to bury a 4th. Helga set her cup down. She looked at her children. Annika had stopped eating. Fritz was staring at the Reverend with an expression Helga could not quite read. Liesel was eating a plum with her full attention. Reverend, she said, I appreciate your concern. I do. But I have an offer to make you in return. He frowned. An offer? Pray for me. He looked confused. I will pray for you, Mrs. Vogelsang. Of course I will. Good. But do not bury me before I am dead. Do you understand the difference? There was a long silence. Thornberry picked up his cup and then set it back down without drinking from it. I was going to offer you the basement of the church, he said quietly. Through the winter, in exchange for some light work, laundering, meal preparation for church functions. I know you were. And you would say no. I would say no. Why? Helga looked at him then, with the full weight of 43 years and 2 months of widowhood, and 1 night of counting stars through a hole in a tin roof. Because, Reverend, my children are going to grow up, and when they do, I want them to remember their mother as someone who built a house with her own hands, not as someone who scrubbed the stones of a church basement for permission to sleep in it. Thornberry was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. The edge was gone. What replaced it was not agreement, but something smaller and more honest. I am afraid for you, Mrs. Vogelsang. I know you are. And that does not change your answer. No, Reverend, it does not. He stood up. He picked up his hat. At the door, he paused and turned back. If you change your mind, I will not. If your children are hungry, then I will feed them. He nodded once, put his hat on, and walked out into the cold dusk. Helga watched him ride away down the road toward town, and then she closed the door and turned back to her children. Fritz was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face in 4 months. It was not anger. It was something closer to attention. Mama, he said, can I help you build it? Helga knelt down beside her son. She took his small fists in her hands and gently opened them, 1 finger at a time. His palms were warm. His hands were still the hands of a child, but they would not always be. Fritz, she said, I am not going to build it without you. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something he had not done in all the weeks since his father's funeral. He put his arms around her neck and held on. Helga held him back. She held him, and she did not cry, because she still could not cry, but she felt the thing in her chest move a fraction of an inch. It was not open. It was not healed, but it had moved. Outside, the first true cold of the season was settling over Stone Ridge Hollow. Inside the cabin, a woman and her son held each other in the lamplight, and the daughter at the table watched them, and slowly, silently, went back to her bread. Tomorrow they would begin. They began at dawn. Helga had borrowed a buck saw from a freighter named Jebediah Crowfoot, who ran supplies between Hollowmere Creek and the mining camps east of town, and who had known Dietrich slightly. Jeb was a man of few words and fewer opinions. He had handed her the saw without comment, and without asking what she intended to do with it. This was, Helga would come to understand, the way Jeb Crowfoot expressed his opinions. He expressed them by not expressing them. A man who loaned a widow a saw in September without requiring her to explain herself was a man who had already decided what he thought of her. She returned the saw at dusk, as promised. Between dawn and dusk, she cut 12 saplings, cottonwood and willow, in roughly equal proportion, each approximately 14 feet long and as thick as her own wrist. She dragged them to the alcove in 2 trips, Annika helping with the lighter ones, Fritz carrying what he could carry, Liesel sitting on a flat rock at the mouth of the alcove and organizing pine needles into piles by length, which was, she had announced with great seriousness, her job. By the end of the first day, Helga had the 12 saplings laid out on the ground like the ribs of something enormous and not yet assembled. She drove 2 stakes into the creek soil at the exact lip of the alcove opening, 11 feet apart, using the back of the splitting maul. The first sapling she buried 18 inches deep on the left side, tamping the earth around it until it held without wobbling. Then she bent it slowly, with the weight of her body rather than the strength of her arms, letting gravity and time do the work that force would damage, into a smooth arc overhead, and she anchored the other end in a corresponding hole on the right side. The result was a semicircle of living wood spanning the full width of the alcove mouth, its apex at roughly 7 feet, curving with a clean geometry that owed nothing to milled lumber and everything to the fact that a living tree, bent slowly and held long enough, remembered the shape it was given. "Mama," Annika said, standing beside her with her hands folded. "It is like a church." Helga had not thought of it that way. She looked at the single arch against the hillside and saw for a moment what her daughter saw. "Yes," she said. "I suppose it is." Fritz was at her other side, watching her hands with the concentration he had once given to watching Dietrich work at the kitchen table. "Why does it not break, Mama?" "Because it is young wood. The wood is still alive inside. It remembers how to bend. Old wood has forgotten. Old wood snaps. Will this wood forget? Yes, in time. But by the time it forgets, it will have hardened into the shape we gave it. And then it will stay that way." Fritz nodded. Helga could see him filing the information somewhere in his head, the same way she had seen Dietrich file information when he was learning a new skill. She turned her face away so her son could not see her expression, and she reached for the second sapling. By the end of the second day, all 12 arches were in place. The framework, in the late afternoon light, looked like the entrance to a tunnel or the skeleton of some creature from a different age. Curved bones arranged with more intention than accident, catching the light in angles that made the men downstream at the lumber yard stop what they were doing and look. One of the men walked up the path that afternoon. He was perhaps 54 years old, broad-shouldered, with the slightly uneven gait of a man who had once injured a knee and never quite recovered. His name, Helga would learn shortly, was Everett Stroud. He had been the engineering lead on a railroad survey crew before a mining claim near Butte had pulled him sideways from his career. He wore his skepticism with the particular confidence of a man who had built enough things to know when something was being built wrong. He stopped at a respectful distance and studied the framework without speaking for nearly a full minute, his hat in his hands. His head tilted at the angle of someone working through a problem he was not yet sure was interesting or merely unfortunate. When he spoke, his voice was measured, genuinely curious rather than dismissive. "That is an interesting notion you are building, ma'am. It is a woodshed, Mr. Stroud. Everett Stroud. Mrs. Vogelsang." He looked at the creek bottom growth, at the arches already beginning to set in their curved positions, at the complete absence of anything resembling conventional walls, or a roof, or a raised floor. "Cottonwood and willow will not hold snow load, Mrs. Vogelsang. The first real storm will flatten this. Snow is going to hit the hillside 20 feet above this spot and redirect. I am not building tall enough to catch it." He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at the angle of the slope above the alcove, traced the path she had described with his eyes, and Helga watched him run the geometry in his head. The way engineers run geometry, following the load path, checking for the failure point, finding where the calculation either held or did not. Something shifted in his expression. Not agreement. Not yet. But the particular recalibration of a man who had realized the question was more complicated than he had initially assessed. He put his hat back on. He walked away. Before he rounded the stand of cottonwoods that would take him out of her sight line, he stopped and looked back at the framework once more. Helga noted it. She noted everything. That night, she and the children slept under a canvas tarp strung between two cottonwoods 30 feet east of the alcove. Liesel slept in her mother's arms. Annika slept beside them with her braid unraveled and her face pressed into the rolled-up coat she was using as a pillow. Fritz lay on Helga's other side, and he was awake for a long time, staring up at the canvas above their heads, and at one point Helga heard him whisper something she could not quite make out. It might have been a word. It might have been a name. She did not ask him. She let him have his privacy. A boy of 8, she was beginning to understand, needed some space inside his grief that did not belong to anyone else. The temperature dropped to 38 degrees that night. Helga slept in her coat, both pairs of stockings, and her boots. She woke 3 times to check on the children. Each time they were sleeping. By the morning of the 3rd day, the frost had killed the last of the wild asters along the creek bank. The purple flowers had gone black overnight and hung from their stems like small flags of surrender. Helga noticed them without sentiment and went back to weaving. She had begun the walls, basket weaving at architectural scale, the same rhythm her grandmother had used making storage containers that had still been in use when Helga left Germany. Over, under, over, under. Each willow shoot pulled tight before the next was started. Her fingers, stiff from the cold in the first hour, loosened as she worked. By mid-morning she had 3 feet of woven lattice wall curving smoothly from the rock face on the left side, closing the alcove's opening with something that already had structural integrity. Not the rigidity of a board wall, but the tensile strength of interlocked living material. The kind of strength that gives rather than breaks, and recovers rather than fails. Annika watched for a long time. Then she came and sat beside her mother and asked, without looking up, "May I try?" Helga handed her a willow shoot. Annika's first weave was crooked. Her second was better. Her third was nearly as tight as her mother's. Helga watched her daughter's hands find the rhythm that her own hands had found at the same age, and she understood that something very old was happening in this alcove. Something older than Montana, and older than the Black Forest, and older than any of the words that she had in any of the 2 languages she spoke. A mother was teaching a daughter. A daughter was learning. If you are listening to this story, and you have ever taught a child something your mother taught you, please leave a comment below and tell me what it was. A recipe. A way of folding a sheet. A song. These are the small threads that hold generations together, and they matter more than we say. I read every comment. If you have not yet subscribed, please do it now, because the next part of this story is going to be difficult, and I want you to find your way back. On the morning of the fourth day, Fritz disappeared. Helga did not realize it at first. She had woken before dawn, built up the small fire she kept going under a rock overhang near the tarp shelter, set water to boil, and gone down to the creek to wash her face. When she came back, Liesel was sitting up, rubbing her eyes, and Annika was folding the blanket the way she had been taught. But Fritz's place was empty, and his coat was gone. "Annika," Helga said, keeping her voice level, "where is your brother?" Annika looked at the empty place beside her. Her face changed in a way that Helga did not like. "I do not know, Mama. He was here when I went to sleep." Helga felt something cold in her chest that was not related to the morning air. "Stay here. Keep your sister with you. I will be back." She looked first along the creek, calling her son's name, her voice carrying in the still morning. She looked next in the alcove, where he sometimes liked to hide behind the woven walls to startle Liesel. He was not there. She walked back toward the cabin, then past it, and then, because something in her mother's instinct pulled her in that direction, she turned east and walked toward town, toward the cemetery. She found him at the third row from the back, sitting on the ground beside his father's grave, the small wooden marker that she had not yet been able to afford to replace with stone. His knees were pulled up to his chest. His face was very dirty. He had been crying, she could see that, but he had stopped by the time she reached him, and he was only sitting. Helga sat down beside her son. She did not speak at first. The grass was cold under her skirt. A meadowlark sang somewhere behind them in the brush. "Fritz," she said finally. He did not look at her. "Fritz, you cannot leave in the night without telling me. I was afraid." "I wanted to ask Papa something," he said. "What did you want to ask him?" Fritz was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in a voice so small she almost did not hear it, "I wanted to ask him why he left us." Helga closed her eyes. "I wanted to ask him," Fritz said, "why he did not fight harder." "Oh, Fritz." "He was the papa. He was supposed to stay, and he did not stay. And now we are going to live in a hole in the ground, and you are going to build it with sticks, and I do not know why Papa could not just stay." Helga did not answer right away. She let her son say it. She had learned in 43 years that sometimes the most important thing a person could do for another person was let them say the unsayable thing and not rush to correct it. When Fritz had stopped speaking, Helga put her arm around his shoulders, and she pulled him against her side, and for the first time since Dietrich's funeral, she let herself feel something other than the cold in her chest. She felt angry at her husband. She felt angry at the cough that had taken him. She felt angry at the doctor who had not been able to save him. She felt angry at the $40 he had borrowed without telling her. She felt angry at the God that Reverend Thornberry preached about every Sunday, the God who had taken her fourth child and now her husband, and had left her alone in a valley with 3 children and $9. She felt angry in a way that was so big she could not contain it, and something in her broke open, and Helga Vogelsang began to cry. She cried for the first time in 4 months. She cried sitting on the cold grass beside her husband's grave, with her son pressed against her side, and her son, seeing her cry, began to cry too, and the two of them sat there at the third row from the back of the Hollowmere Creek Cemetery, and they cried together until the meadowlark stopped singing, and the sun rose over the eastern ridge, and the frost began to melt on the grass around them. When she was done, Helga wiped her face on her sleeve. She wiped Fritz's face on the other sleeve. She smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "Fritz," she said, "I am angry at him too." Fritz looked up at her. "I am so angry at him, Fritz. I am so angry he did not stay. And I do not know who to tell. And I do not know what to do with it. And I have been carrying it for 4 months, and I did not know how heavy it was until right now. But you are not supposed to be angry at him. He is dead. People do not stop being people when they die, my love. You can be angry at a dead person. I think God understands." Fritz considered this. "Can you be angry and still love them?" "Yes. I think that is mostly what love is at the end. Being angry and loving anyway." They sat for a while longer. The sun climbed. Fritz put his hand in his mother's hand. "Mama," he said, "can we go back and build the woodshed now?" "Yes, my love, we can." They walked back to Stone Ridge Hollow together. When they arrived, Annika and Liesel were sitting at the mouth of the alcove. Annika had been working on the wall in her mother's absence. The third row of woven willow was in place, tight and even. Liesel had been organizing small stones by color, her pink tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth. Helga looked at her 3 children. The closed thing in her chest was not closed anymore. It ached, but it was open. And open things could heal. She picked up a willow shoot. She began to weave. Fritz sat down beside her and picked up a shoot of his own. By the end of the 4th day, the walls were halfway complete. By the end of the 7th day, the walls were at full height, and Helga had begun to mix clay. She had found the clay deposit upstream 2 years earlier, in a walk with Dietrich that had meant nothing at the time. Heavy red-brown clay with enough structure to hold its shape when worked. She hauled it to the alcove in the 2 flour sacks she had repurposed as carrying vessels. She mixed it with dried creek grass and horse manure she had asked permission to collect from the stable at the East Road. She combined these things with creek water in a proportion she adjusted by feel until the mixture had the consistency and the behavior she was looking for. On the 8th day, as she was pressing the first handfuls of clay into the willow lattice, a man came walking along the creek path. He was perhaps 52, heavily built, with the hands of a man who had been in physical conversation with stone and wood for 30 years. His name, she would learn, was Cornelius Harrow. He was a mason and general builder, born in Pennsylvania, who had come west following the mining expansion and found steady enough work repairing the structural failures that came from people building too quickly in a difficult climate. He stood at the edge of the work area and watched her for nearly 5 minutes without speaking. His arms crossed, his expression focused in the way of someone cataloging details rather than forming an opinion. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the particular flatness of professional observation. "Wattle and daub." It was not a question. "Yes," Helga said. "You are from the Black Forest." She stopped working and looked at him. "How did you know?" "I worked with an old German in Pennsylvania when I was a young man. He taught me this technique. Most Americans do not know it. Most American builders, I should say." He walked closer. He touched the clay wall with his fingertips. "What are you mixing into the clay?" "Dried grass and horse manure. That is why it will not crack when it freezes. The fiber keeps the matrix together when the moisture expands." He walked the perimeter of the structure, pausing at the back where the arches met the rock face, touching the stone with his fingertips, the way Helga had done the day before. "You have good thermal mass at the back. The rock will hold heat for 8 to 10 hours after the fire goes out in the front area." He looked at the overlapping bark pieces she had begun to stack nearby, which she had cut from the ponderosa ridge above. "Those bark shingles you are overlapping downslope?" "Yes." "Good. Shingled wrong. That is where the water comes in. He looked at her directly for the first time. This is going to work, Mrs. Vogelsang. She pulled the next handful of clay through its sequence. I know, Mr. Harrow. He left without ceremony. She heard later that he had mentioned her work at the lumber yard, and the word had moved through the small professional community of men who built things for a living, and it had moved with the specificity that made it land differently than gossip. 3 days later, Klaus came walking up the path from the road. He was not alone. Beside him walked a large man in a wool coat and a silver star on his lapel. Sheriff Bowden from Hollowmere Creek. A man Helga had seen perhaps 6 times in her 22 years in the territory, always at a distance, always passing through town on other people's business. Today, his business was hers. Klaus would not meet her eyes. Sister, he said, Matilda. She said we could not wait the 60 days. She said if you fail, the tools will be gone. She said the sheriff has to witness the claim. She said. Klaus, Helga said, please, look at me. He looked at her. His face was the color of ash. Klaus, are you taking your brother's tools today? Matilda said. I am asking you, Klaus, not Matilda. You. He could not answer. Helga stood very still. Behind her, Annika had come out of the dugout tarp shelter. Fritz was beside his sister, holding a piece of split pine. Liesel was sitting on the flat rock, and she had stopped organizing her pine needles because she had felt the shift in the air the way small children feel shifts in the air. Helga walked to the small wooden chest where she kept the last things that had belonged to Dietrich. The hand plane, the 2 chisels, the small iron hammer with the hickory handle. She set them on the ground at the sheriff's feet. Her hands were steady. She would not let them shake. Take them, Klaus. They are yours. Helga. Take them. It was then that a voice spoke from the path behind them. Stop. Everett Stroud was walking up the creek path. He was carrying no weapon. He was carrying a small leather purse. He walked past Klaus and past the sheriff, and he stopped in front of the wooden chest, and he looked down at the tools on the ground. Sheriff Bowden, Everett said, I am going to save you a ride back to town. I am purchasing these tools from Mrs. Vogelsang. $45. Witness it if you need to witness something. He opened the purse. He counted out the coins onto the flat rock beside Liesel. $45 in silver and gold, laid out in the cold October sunlight. Klaus, Everett said, take 40 of that. It is yours. Tell your wife the debt is paid. Klaus looked at the money. He looked at Everett. He looked at Helga. I am sorry, sister, he said. The words were so quiet, she almost did not hear them. I know you are, Klaus. He took the $40. He did not take the tools. He turned and walked back down the path. The sheriff looked once at Everett, once at Helga, tipped his hat, and followed. When they were out of sight, Everett bent down and picked up the hand plane. He turned it over in his hands. He set it back down beside the chisels and the hammer. Mrs. Vogelsang, he said, these tools are yours. I have no use for a hand plane. You may pay me back when you have something to pay me back with. No interest, no deadline. Helga looked at him. Mr. Stroud, why? Everett was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the splitting maul leaning against the rock. He looked at the woodshed, half clayed, the bark roof not yet begun. He looked at Annika, still standing in the doorway of the tarp shelter, holding her brother's hand. My wife, he said, was named Mercy. She died 7 years ago. She was a builder, too. Not wood, quilts. She would sit at her frame 16 hours a day, some weeks. Nobody paid her what the quilts were worth. She did not care about that. She cared that the children in the houses where the quilts went slept warm. He paused. Mercy would not have forgiven me if I stood here today and watched you lose your husband's tools. That is why. He touched the brim of his hat. He walked back down the path. Helga stood for a long time beside the wooden chest. Annika came to stand beside her. Fritz came to stand on her other side. "Mama," Annika said, "who was that man?" "A kind one, meine Liebe. A very kind one." She picked up the hand plane. She held it against her chest. She carried it into the shelter and set it in the place where Dietrich had always kept it when they had lived in the cabin. 2 days later, a storm came down from the continental divide. Helga had known it was coming. She had felt the pressure drop in the morning. She had seen the yellow-gray clouds banking behind the ridge by mid-afternoon. By dusk, the first drops of cold rain were hitting the canvas tarp she still slept under with her children. By midnight, the rain had turned to sleet. By 2 in the morning, the wind had picked up to 40 miles an hour and was driving the sleet horizontally against the windward side of the shelter she had built. And at 3 in the morning, Liesel began to burn with fever. Helga woke because her youngest child was making a small sound against her neck. Not crying. Whimpering. Helga put her hand on the child's forehead and felt a heat that should not have been possible in a human body. "Liesel," she whispered. "Liesel, my love, can you hear Mama?" Liesel's eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused. Her lips were dry and cracked. She did not seem to know where she was. Helga's mind went very still. There was a doctor in Hollowmere Creek, 4 miles away. It was 3 in the morning. The wind was 40 miles an hour. The sleet was coming down in sheets. The road was not a road anymore. It was a river of ice. Annika was awake now. She had felt her mother move. "Mama, what is it?" "Liesel has a fever." "How high?" "High." Fritz sat up. His small face was pale in the lamplight. He did not speak. Helga had a choice to make. She had one choice to make, and she had perhaps 2 minutes to make it. She could leave her other 2 children under the tarp in the storm and try to walk 4 miles in the dark through 40-mile-an-hour sleet to bring a doctor back who might or might not come. She could stay. If she went, she might not make it. If she did make it, she might not make it back. If she stayed, Liesel might die. Helga looked at her 3 children in the lamplight. Annika, watching her mother's face with the quiet attention she had carried since birth. Fritz, holding Liesel's small hand in his own. Liesel, her eyes half closed, her breath coming shallow. Helga made her choice. She stayed. She pulled Liesel into her lap. She wrapped her in every blanket they had. She took the tin cup she had filled with creek water the night before, and she began to press cold water to Liesel's forehead, to her neck, to her wrists. She took off the child's small shift dress, which was soaked with sweat, and she wrapped her in dry cloth. "Annika," she said, "I need you to build up the fire under the rock overhang. Can you do that?" "Yes, Mama." "Fritz, I need you to sit here and hold your sister's hand. And I need you to talk to her. Tell her about anything. Tell her about the stones you have collected. Tell her about the creek. Keep her awake. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mama." Annika went out into the sleet. Fritz began to talk to his sister in a low, steady voice about the colors of the stones in the creek bed. Helga continued to press cold water to Liesel's forehead. Outside, the wind roared against the hillside. The rain was turning back to snow. The temperature was dropping past 20 degrees. Somewhere up the canyon, a tree came down with a crack that sounded like a rifle shot. Helga began to sing. She sang in German, a lullaby her mother had sung to her, which her mother had sung to her own children in a village in the Black Forest 50 years before. She sang the words softly against the top of her youngest child's head. She sang while the fever burned. She sang while Fritz talked about stones. She sang while Annika came back in from the sleet with wet hair and red cheeks and reported that the fire was built up. She sang for 2 hours without stopping. At 5 in the morning, Liesel's breath deepened. At 5:30, the fever broke. At 6, Helga felt the child's forehead and found it only warm. Helga stopped singing. She sat very still in the tarp shelter with her daughter in her arms. Annika was asleep against her shoulder. Fritz was asleep across her knees. The wind was still blowing outside, but the sleet had stopped, and the first gray light of dawn was beginning to lift behind the eastern ridge. Helga did not cry this time. She had cried 4 days ago at her husband's grave, and the crying had been the breaking of something that had been closed too long. Tonight, what she felt was not breakable. It was harder and quieter. It was the specific exhaustion of a mother who had been asked to choose, and had chosen, and had been lucky. She whispered, not to God, not to Reverend Thornberry's God, but to her father, who had been dead for 27 years. Vater, she whispered. Danke. Thank you. Outside, the storm was moving east. The structure she had built was still standing. At 8 in the morning, Helga carried Liesel out to the alcove to check on the woodshed. The child was weak, but awake, her small arms around her mother's neck. The walls of the woodshed were intact. The bark roof was intact. The clay was darkened on the windward side, but not cracked. Helga put her hand inside the structure and felt the dry air. She pulled a piece of firewood from the middle of the stack and pressed her thumbnail into the end grain. 14% moisture content, the number she needed. That afternoon, Everett Stroud came up the creek path. He was carrying something. Helga saw him coming and stood at the mouth of the alcove with Liesel on her hip. Annika came to stand beside her. Fritz came out of the shelter with a piece of firewood in his hand because he had been helping his mother check the stack. Everett Stroud stopped at the respectful distance he had stopped at before. He looked at the woodshed, which had survived the storm. He looked at Helga, who was holding her youngest child, and at Annika, who was holding her mother's hand, and at Fritz, who was holding a piece of firewood. He took off his hat. Mrs. Vogelsang, he said, I owe you a second apology. For what this time, Mr. Stroud? For assuming you did not know what you were doing. He set the thing he was carrying on the flat rock at the edge of the work area. It was a glass bottle. Milk. Fresh milk, which in Montana Territory in October was worth more than its weight in almost anything. I heard the little one was sick, he said. I hope she is better. She is better. I am glad to hear it. There was a moment of silence. Stroud looked at the woodshed again. Then he looked back at Helga. If you have need of anything in the coming weeks, please send word. I am up at the surveyor's office in Hollowmere Creek most days. Thank you, Mr. Stroud. He walked back down the path. Helga watched him go. Beside her, Annika said quietly, Mama, why does that man keep helping us? Because he has been lonely, meine Liebe. And lonely people recognize each other. Annika considered this. Then she took the bottle of milk carefully in both hands and carried it into the shelter to give to her sister. That night, for the first time in 11 nights, Helga slept more than 2 hours in a row. Before I continue, I want to tell you something. I know some of you are listening to this story because you have known loneliness yourself. Maybe you have lost a spouse, or a child, or a friend. Maybe you are going through a hard winter of your own right now. If that is you, please know that I see you. Leave a comment and tell me your name and where you are. Sometimes just being named is a small kind of warmth. And if this story has been a companion to you this morning, please tap the subscribe button. I would like to keep telling you stories. Now let me continue. The weeks that followed changed in a way Helga did not expect. She had thought she was building a woodshed. She had thought she was building a shelter for her children. She had thought the work was private. She had been wrong. Word moved. Word moved the way it always moved in small communities on the frontier, which was through the professional networks of men who built things for a living and through the domestic networks of women who had watched their husbands fail and their children shiver, and who were beginning to wonder if there were other ways. Cornelius Harrow mentioned the Vogelsang woman's clay technique to a young apprentice named Davis, a 23-year-old from Kentucky, who had come west with ideas about mining and was now discovering that his actual aptitude ran toward construction. Davis mentioned it to his landlord. The landlord mentioned it to his wife. The wife mentioned it to her sister. By the third week of October, Helga had finished the dugout shelter 20 feet east of the woodshed. It was 4 feet by 8 feet, with a standing height of 5.5 feet at the center ridge. She had roofed it with pine poles covered in bark and sod. She had installed the small 3-legged stove she had acquired in a trade with a man named Eccles, who repaired tools behind the blacksmith shop. The stove had cost her $2.90 and one of Dietrich's pocket watches, which had kept time poorly, but had been the only object left that smelled faintly like him. It was objectively a hole in the earth with a fire in it. It was also, Helga had calculated, the single most thermally efficient shelter design available to a woman with her resources in this climate. The children slept in the dugout. Helga slept in the dugout. The earth maintained a consistent temperature of approximately 48 degrees at depth, regardless of what the air above was doing. A fire running for 3 hours in the morning brought the interior to 65 and held it there for the better part of the day. The split pine from her woodshed, dry and clean, produced no creosote buildup, no smoke accumulation, none of the slow carbon poisoning that killed people in poorly ventilated spaces with wet wood. Helga slept better in that hole than she had in the cabin she had shared with Dietrich for 11 years. She was not sure what to make of that, and she decided not to make anything of it. In late October, a woman named Delphia Merriweather stopped on her way to the creek with a water bucket and watched Helga split pine for 20 minutes without speaking. Delphia was 37, married to a carpenter who had broken his hand in September and was still 3 weeks from being able to work, with 4 children and a household that was managing but not easily. She was not a member of Reverend Thornberry's congregation, though she attended occasionally when her husband was well enough to go with her. Her question, when she asked it, was practical and without preamble. How much did the woodshed actually cost? $6.20 in purchased materials. The rest was collected. Delphia looked at the woodshed. Then she said, "Miles says we need 2 more cords before the end of the month. The yard on 3rd Street wants $4 a cord for anything decent. If you have time in the next 3 days, I can show you the arch technique. The building site matters most. You need a north-facing slope with natural shelter, even a small one. I will come look at it tomorrow." Delphia left and came back an hour later with a plate of cold cornbread that she set on the flat splitting rock without comment and walked away. Helga ate it standing up between splitting sessions. She thought about Delphia Merriweather and about the woman's 4 children and about the bridge that had been built between them in 27 words and a plate of cornbread. She thought about her father. She thought, and this was new, about herself. And then, in the first week of November, Annika came home from school in tears. She had been going to school every other day since the beginning of October. walking the 2 miles along the creek path in the mornings with Fritz beside her, walking home with him in the afternoons. Today, she had walked home alone, because Fritz had stayed behind to help the schoolmaster carry firewood, and when she came through the canvas flap of the dugout, her face was red from more than the cold. "Annika," Helga said. "What is it, meine Liebe?" Annika did not answer at first. She put down her book. She took off her coat. She sat on the edge of the bed. "Mama," she said, "the girls at school called me something today." "What did they call you?" "They called me the witch's daughter." Helga felt a stillness settle into her chest that she recognized. It was the stillness that came before a decision. "Why did they call you that, Annika?" "Because Reverend Thornberry preached on Sunday about people who choose caves over Christian community. He did not say your name, Mama, but everyone knew he meant you. And so today at recess, the other girls told me my mother was a witch who had made a den in the hillside, and they said I lived in a hole in the ground like an animal, and they said the clay on our walls was made with blood." Annika stopped. She could not say more. Helga sat down beside her daughter. She did not immediately defend herself. She did not immediately defend the structure. She let her daughter sit in the shape of what had happened. And then, after a long moment, she said, "Annika, bring me your grandfather's notebook." Annika frowned. "His notebook? Bring it to me." Annika fetched the notebook. Helga opened it on her lap. She turned past the pages of arch diagrams, past the pages of clay compositions, past the drawings of bark roofing systems. She turned to a blank page near the back of the book. She took a piece of charcoal from the fire and began to draw. She drew a cross-section of the woodshed. She drew the load path of a snowfall coming down the slope at a 27-degree angle. She drew the way the dome deflected the snow to either side. She drew arrows indicating the redirection of force. She drew the thermal mass of the rear rock wall. She drew the cross-ventilation of the structure. She drew until there was no more room on the page, and then she turned to the next page and drew more. "Annika," she said, "tomorrow morning you will take this notebook to school, and when the girls call you the witch's daughter, you will open this book, and you will show them what your mother and your grandfather know." Annika looked at the pages. "Mama, they will not understand these drawings. Some of them will, not all, but some. The ones who do understand will tell the ones who do not, and the ones who do not will understand that you are not someone they can easily laugh at. Knowledge is a shield, Annika. A small one, but it is a real one. What if they still call me names? Then they call you names, and you come home, and we will think about what to do next." Annika held the notebook against her chest. Her eyes were still red, but something had shifted in her face. "Mama," she said, "did you ever get called names?" "Yes." "What did you do?" Helga thought for a long moment. "I grew up," she said, "and the people who called me names grew up too. And some of them became kind, and some of them did not. And I stopped being able to be hurt by the ones who did not. But Annika, that takes time. You do not have to be strong about this tomorrow. You only have to go to school." Annika nodded. She set the notebook on the small shelf beside the stove. She went to help Fritz and Liesel with their supper. Annika did not sleep well that night. Helga heard her turning under the blanket. She heard her get up once to drink water from the tin cup by the stove. She did not go to her daughter. She understood that there were things an 11-year-old had to sit with alone, without a mother to smooth them over. The next morning, Annika took the notebook to school. She came home that afternoon walking slowly. Her face was calm. She set the notebook down on the shelf beside the stove. She did not volunteer what had happened, and Helga did not ask. But that night at supper, Fritz said, "Two girls at school asked Annika if they could see our house." "Did they?" Helga said. "Annika said yes. They are coming on Saturday." Annika did not look up from her bowl, but the corners of her mouth had turned up, just slightly. Just enough. On Saturday, 3 girls walked up the creek path. Helga recognized the oldest one as Henrietta Merriweather, the 9-year-old daughter of Delphia. They stopped at the edge of the alcove and stared at the structure with the wide eyes of children who had come a long way to see something they had heard about. Annika came out of the dugout. She looked at the 3 girls. The 3 girls looked at her. "We wanted to see the building," Henrietta said. "All right," Annika said, and Annika Vogelsang, 11 years old, showed 3 other girls the woodshed. She explained the arches, she explained the clay. She let them touch the wall. By the time their mothers called them home in the late afternoon, the 3 girls had been given, without any of them quite realizing it, a short lesson in the physics of load distribution. Helga watched from the doorway of the dugout. She did not weep. But the thing in her chest, that had been slowly opening since the morning at Dietrich's grave, opened a little more. On the 12th of November, the first heavy snow came. It came not as weather, but as a pressure change, a density in the air that preceded the sky's visible commitment. By evening, the temperature was falling at a rate Helga had not experienced since the winter of 1872, dropping through the teens toward single digits, with the mechanical certainty of something that had made up its mind. She checked every seal on the dugout entry. She checked the woodshed door. She added a second rock to the windward base of the burlap to hold it tight against the bottom of the frame. Then she went inside the dugout with her children and did not go out again until morning, 8 degrees below zero at first light. The creek had stopped talking. Ice had locked it from bank to bank some time before midnight. The sky to the northwest had the flat white uniformity of a system with more material to deliver than it had delivered. Helga started the stove with birch bark and 2 pine splits, the wood catching without the hesitation that wet wood produced. The flame moving clean and yellow. The interior came up to 52 degrees in 35 minutes. Enough. She made cornmeal porridge, and the children ate it sitting up in bed because the floor was still cold. Annika fed Liesel small spoonfuls because Liesel was still a little weak from the fever and preferred her sister's hands to her mother's. Fritz ate his own porridge and asked if there was more, and Helga gave him a second portion from her own bowl and ate half of what was left. The storm ran for 3 days. When it was over, Helga walked the perimeter of the woodshed and found that it had performed exactly as she had calculated. The snow had hit the slope above the alcove and redirected. The dome had shed what little had tried to settle on it. The clay was not cracked. The bark roof had not leaked. Inside, the wood was dry. On the 19th of November, Jeb Crowfoot's wagon stopped at the mouth of the alcove. Jeb climbed down. He walked up to Helga, who was stacking the half-cord of pine she had cut that morning, and he delivered the news with the same neutral delivery he applied to weather reports and road conditions. "Family came in on the afternoon train," he said. "Man, woman, 3 children. Woman visibly pregnant. They had nothing. The man is sick. They have been directed to the church." Helga knew, without asking for details, what kind of sick. She had heard that cough in Dietrich's chest for the last 4 months of his life. She recognized it by its texture, the dry depth of it, the way it came from a level below where ordinary illness lived. "Thank you, Mr. Crowfoot. I thought you would want to know." He climbed back into his wagon. He drove away. Helga set down the piece of pine she had been holding. She looked at the stacks of firewood, the winter supply. the margin she had calculated down to the pound. She walked to the church that evening. The basement was low-ceilinged and smelled of cold stone and old ash from a fireplace that had not been cleaned since the previous winter. A single lamp hung from a hook near the entry and threw more shadow than light. 3 children were arranged on the floor in the corner farthest from the door, sharing 2 thin blankets, the oldest sitting upright with the youngest leaning against her, in the particular configuration of children who had learned to conserve warmth through proximity. A man lay on a plank bed along the right wall with his eyes closed and his breathing audible from the doorway. Not labored exactly, but conscious. The breath of a body that was working at something. A woman sat on the floor beside the plank with her back against the wall and her hands folded over the full roundness of her belly. She was perhaps 34. She had the bone structure of someone who had been healthy and capable before circumstances had spent those reserves over a period of months. Her eyes, when she looked up at the sound of Helga's entrance, were clear and direct. The gaze of someone who had made a clear-eyed accounting of her situation and was neither dramatizing it nor pretending it was other than it was. Helga stood in the middle of the basement floor. "How much firewood do you have?" she asked. The woman's voice, when it came, was steady. "Maybe 2 weeks, if we are very careful. Torvald has not been able to cut for 6 weeks. There is no money to buy more. You need 4 cords minimum to make it to April." "I know." A pause. "I do not know who would sell to us on any terms we could meet." The 3 children had gone quiet in the way of children who had learned that adult conversations about resources required stillness. The oldest one, a girl of about 7, watched Helga with particular attention. "I am Helga Vogelsang. I am building 2 additional storage structures before spring. I need workers. I am paying in firewood instead of cash, because cash is what I do not have either. A day of stacking from your children buys a week's worth of splits. They stack, I cut. Does that seem reasonable?" The woman on the floor looked at Helga with an expression that was quiet and held. She knew what was happening. The exchange rate Helga was offering was far more generous than the work would command. Both women understood this, and neither commented on it. "I am Ingeborg Halvorsen," she said. "My husband is Torvald. This is Solveig, and Bjorn, and Agnetha. I accept your offer, Mrs. Vogelsang, with my whole heart." Helga nodded once. Then she turned and looked at the 3 children in the corner. "Solveig," she said to the oldest, "can you carry a piece of firewood the size of your forearm?" Solveig nodded. "Then you will start tomorrow. I will send my daughter Annika to show you how." Helga walked home along the creek path in the dark. The temperature was 11 degrees. The stars were the dense, specific population of a Montana winter sky. She was thinking about Torvald Halvorsen, and about his cough, and about Dietrich, and about the fact that she had built a small thing in a hillside that had turned out to be big enough for more than one family. She was thinking also about the words Reverend Thornberry had used about caves and Christian community. And she was thinking that sometimes the difference between a cave and a community was not in the walls. It was in who was invited through the door. The weeks that followed established a pattern. In the mornings, Helga cut. In the afternoons, Annika walked the 2 miles to the church basement to teach Solveig and Bjorn how to stack the wood she had cut. Agnetha, 4, sorted kindling by size and had decided, with the seriousness of a small child who had been given a role, that this was her job and she intended to execute it without corners being cut. By the end of November, a cord was stacked in the corner of the basement. By the middle of December, 2 cords. By Christmas, almost 3. Annika and Solveig had become inseparable. Solveig was 7, quiet, with the particular watchfulness of a child who had watched her father get weaker over many months, and who had learned to conserve her own energy. Annika was 11, and she had found in Solveig something she had not known she had been missing. She had found a younger girl to teach. She taught Solveig the stacking pattern. She taught her the air gap principle. She taught her why some wood burned hot and some burned cool, and how to tell the difference by weight. She taught her the small portion of her grandfather's Black Forest knowledge that she herself had absorbed. And Solveig absorbed it, the way Annika had absorbed her mother's teaching, and the way Helga had absorbed her father's. Torvald Halvorsen died on the 7th of January. Ingeborg woke before dawn to the change in his breathing. She sat beside him until it stopped, and then she sat beside him after it stopped, with the stillness of someone who had been preparing for a thing, and who found when it arrived that preparation and the actual event were not the same experience at all. The children slept through it. Ingeborg let them sleep. She sent word to Helga at first light. Annika carried the message because Annika had been walking to the basement every afternoon for 6 weeks and knew the path better than her mother did by now. Annika delivered the words, then she sat down on the floor beside Solveig, and she put her arms around her friend, and she did not let go. Helga arrived an hour later. Reverend Thornberry was already there, with his Bible, performing the appropriate rites with the care and precision he brought to all official functions. He read from the 34th Psalm. "The Lord is close to the broken-hearted." His voice was steady, but Helga noticed, as she stood near the basement door with her hat in her hands, that the Reverend's voice carried something underneath the resonance, something that sounded less like performance and more like recognition. She watched his face, and she saw, for the first time, what she had never quite seen before. Silas Thornberry was a man who had lost someone, once, a long time ago, and who had been building his entire ministry around the fear of losing anyone else. He had come to her cabin in September because he had been afraid she would die. He had preached against her in November because he had been afraid she would succeed, and that her success would change something in the community that he did not know how to accommodate. And now he was reading the 34th Psalm over a man who had died in his basement, a man whose family would have died with him, had not a woman he had preached against built a small thing in a hillside. His eyes moved past the stack of firewood in the corner. They did not settle. They did not quite avoid. He finished the service. He closed his Bible. He looked once at Helga. Not long. Not long enough to constitute anything as formal as an acknowledgement, but long enough to be intentional. He left. Ingeborg sat by her husband's body for another hour. Then she stood up. She smoothed her apron. She looked at her children, who were now awake and silent, and she said, "Children, your papa has gone to be with God. We are going to live now. That is what your papa would want. We are going to live, and we are going to be kind, and we are going to remember him." Solveig walked across the room and put her hand in her mother's hand. Agnetha, 4, began to cry. Not loudly, just quietly. Helga picked up Agnetha and held her. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to pause. If this story has been a hard one to listen to, I understand. Grief is the oldest companion some of us have. If you have lost someone you loved, please take a breath with me now. Wherever you are listening from, please know that your grief is honored here. Leave a comment and tell me their name, if you are willing. Say it out loud even. Names are one of the things we can still give to the people we have lost. And if you would like to hear more stories that honor women and the losses they have carried, please subscribe to this channel. Now let me bring this home. On the 1st of February, Ingeborg Halvorsen gave birth in the basement of the Hollowmere Creek Methodist Church. The labor was long and hard, but without complication. The midwife from the east side of town reported throughout the afternoon that what was happening was difficult, but the baby was in a good position. At 6:47 in the evening, the baby was born. A girl, small, with a full-volume announcement of healthy lungs. Helga was there because Ingeborg had asked her to be there, and Annika had brought the message at midday, and Helga had walked to the church through the cold afternoon to sit with her friend. The basement was warm. The stove was burning dry pine at a measured rate. Outside, the temperature was 11 degrees. Inside, a lamp was burning, and Annika was holding Solveig's hand, and Fritz had taken Bjorn outside to look at the stars, and Agnetha and Liesel had fallen asleep together in a corner. Ingeborg held her daughter. She looked at the baby with the expression that followed the end of the largest effort a body could be asked to make. A long, quiet look, the look of a woman who had done something enormous and was now simply resting. She looked at Helga across the dim room. "Helga," she said. "Yes, in 34 years, Helga, I have never been named after anyone. My mother named me after an aunt she disliked. My husband called me Inga because he could not pronounce my full name. I have been a daughter, and a wife, and a mother, and I have never once been the thing a person looked at and decided to remember." Ingeborg paused. The baby made a small sound against her chest. "I would like to name my daughter Helga. I would like her middle name to be Torvald, for her father. Helga Torvald Halvorsen. I am asking your permission, because it is your name, and because I want you to know that I am not naming her for what you did for us. I am naming her for what you did for yourself, so that my daughter will grow up knowing that there are women in the world who do not wait to be rescued. They build. And sometimes the buildings are big enough for other people." Helga did not answer for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick. "I would be honored, Ingeborg." Then she crossed the room. She sat down beside Ingeborg on the plank bed. She looked at the small face of the child who would carry her name into a century she herself would not see. And Helga Vogelsang cried for the second time in her life since Dietrich's funeral. She cried holding a baby that was not her own. She cried with her friend beside her. She cried the way a woman cries when something she did not know she needed has been given to her, unasked, by another woman who had understood what she needed without being told. Annika came across the room. She sat down on her mother's other side. She put her head against her mother's shoulder. Outside, the stars were out. Fritz was showing Bjorn the constellation his grandfather had taught him about, the one that the Germans called the Great Bear. The winter held for 2 more months. The wood stack in the basement diminished. Spring came, as it always did, in the particular reluctant way that spring came to Montana. The creek broke up over 3 noisy days, the ice going out in chunks. The cottonwoods put out their first leaf buds, small and yellow-green. Ingeborg started teaching 3 children from the north side of Hollowmere Creek, 4 mornings a week. Delphia Merriweather had helped arrange it. The income was modest, but reliable. Ingeborg moved her family out of the church basement in April, into a small rental cabin near the school, and Helga helped her build a shelter on the property by summer. Reverend Thornberry came to the alcove on the 17th of February. He did not stand at a distance. He walked up to the mouth of the structure, and he took off his hat. "Mrs. Vogelsang," he said, "I have said things about you from the pulpit that I now have to unsay. I am not coming to ask your forgiveness. You owe me nothing, and I have no right to request it. I am coming to tell you that I was afraid. I was afraid of burying you. I was afraid of what it would mean if I could not bury you. and I made my fear your problem. And that was wrong." Helga listened. When he was done, she said, "Reverend Thornberry, I accept your apology. Not because I have to, because I have been afraid myself, and I understand what fear can do to a person's judgment." "Thank you, Mrs. Vogelsang. Will you come in? I have coffee." He did come in. He sat at the small table in her dugout. He met her 3 children. He asked Annika about her studies. He asked Fritz what he wanted to be when he grew up. Fritz said he wanted to build houses. Reverend Thornberry said that was a fine thing to want to be. He did not become a close friend, but he did not remain an enemy. Everett Stroud came by the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and the Sunday after that. He brought a small book of geometry for Annika. He brought a wooden puzzle for Fritz. He brought nothing for Liesel except his own patient attention, which turned out to be what Liesel had needed. He never asked Helga for anything. He came and he sat, and sometimes he stayed for supper, and sometimes he did not. They did not speak of marriage. They did not speak of love. They were 2 people in their late 40s and early 50s who had buried their partners and who could sit in the same room without requiring anything of each other. That, Helga found, was its own quiet mercy. 25 years later, in the autumn of 1901, Helga Vogelsang was 68 years old. She walked the path along Stone Ridge Hollow Creek one morning in September, following the path she had walked for the first time on an afternoon in 1876. The creek ran low in its late summer way, clear over the gravel bed. The cottonwoods were beginning their turn. She opened the door of the old woodshed, which was still there, still standing, weathered to the color of the surrounding hillside. Inside, the rock face at the back was still solid. The willow frame had hardened into its permanent shape years ago. The clay walls had the patina of something old enough to be part of the landscape. She set 4 photographs on a stone ledge at the back of the shelter. The first was of Annika, 36, a schoolteacher at a country school in Wisconsin, married to a carpenter she had met at a church picnic, mother of 2. She had never become famous. She had written 3 letters a year to her mother, every year, without fail. The second was a photograph of Fritz, 33, in Oregon. Fritz had struggled in his 20s. Helga knew this because Fritz had told her. He had drunk for several years in a way that had frightened her. He had stopped, with help, on the far side of his 29th birthday. He now built small houses for working families. He had not married. He wrote every month. The third was a small card from Liesel, 30, a nurse in Helena, newly married, laughing in the photograph. The fourth was a letter from Helga Torvald Halverson, 25, writing from the Dakota Territory, where she was working as a carpenter, building small houses for settlers who could not afford to hire help. "Aunt Helga," the letter said, "I wanted you to know that I have started my own crew. 3 women. I learned the clay mixture from my mother, who learned it from you. Please tell Annika I send my love." Helga stood in the alcove for a long moment. She put her hand against the back wall. The rock was cold and solid and older than she could imagine. "Vater," she whispered, "Ich hoffe, ich habe es richtig gemacht." Father, I hope I did it right. She closed the door of the woodshed. She walked back down the path toward her home. Everett Stroud was waiting for her on the porch of her house, as he had waited nearly every Sunday morning for the past 23 years. He was 79 now, his hair entirely white, his hands slower than they had been, his bad knee no better than it had been in 1876. He had never asked her to marry him. She had never asked him why he had not. They had worked out, between them, an arrangement that did not need to be named. He ate breakfast with her on Sundays. He read the paper on her porch in the afternoons. He went home to his own small house in Hollowmere Creek at the end of each visit. They had kept their separate lives and shared their separate peace. "Tea is on, Helga," he said, looking up from his paper. "Thank you, Everett." She sat down beside him on the porch. The morning sun climbed over the eastern ridge. The meadowlark was singing in the brush behind the garden, the way meadowlarks had been singing for every September of her life in Montana. "I went up to the old hillside," she said. "I thought you might. It is still standing." "I am not surprised." They were quiet for a while. Everett turned a page of his paper. Helga watched the light change on the cottonwoods across the yard. "Everett," she said. "Yes." "Do you ever wonder what Mercy would have thought of all this?" He folded the paper carefully and laid it on the small table between them. He took a long time to answer. "I think," he said finally, "she would have come to sit with you. I think she would have brought a quilt. I think she would have said very little, and she would have stayed for a long time. That is what she did with the women she recognized. I wish I had known her." "You did, Helga. You have been knowing her for 23 years, every Sunday." Helga reached over and took his hand. They sat like that for a long time. Two old people on a porch in Montana in the year 1901. A woman who had arrived at that porch by way of a rock-slide alcove and a cough in her husband's chest and $9 in her apron. A man who had arrived at that porch by way of a quilt frame, and a woman named Mercy, and a surveyor's office in Hollowmere Creek. They did not speak of love. They did not speak of grief. They had said, many times, in many small ways across many Sundays, everything they needed to say. Inside the house, the tea was getting cold. Helga would pour it out in a moment. She would pour it out, and she would warm the pot, and she would make them a fresh cup, because that was what Sunday mornings were for. But first, she sat. She sat beside the man who had saved her husband's tools one October morning 25 years ago, and who had never asked her for anything in return. She sat in the house she had built, on the land she had earned, with the letters from her 3 children on the mantel, and a framed photograph of a young woman named Helga Torvald Halvorsen on the wall. And she understood, as the morning light came fully into the valley, that the hillside had not remembered her name by accident. It had remembered her name because she had taught it to remember. And now other hillsides, in other valleys, were learning to remember other women's names. Because that was what her father had taught her, long ago, in a forest she had not seen in 50 years. Wood bent slowly remembered the shape it was given. People were not so different. If you are listening to this, and you have made it with me all the way to the end, I want to thank you. Helga's story was not a fairy tale. It was not a triumph. It was the story of an ordinary woman who was afraid, and who kept working anyway, and whose children grew up to be real people, with real struggles. She did not become famous. She did not become rich. She became known by the hillside she built against, and by the baby who carried her name, and by the Sunday mornings she shared with a man who understood her silences. If you know a woman like Helga, please tell her today. Tell her that someone has seen what she has built. And if you have been a woman like Helga yourself, please know that I see you. I see the years you have carried. I see the things you have built when no one was watching. Leave a comment below and tell me about a woman in your life whose name deserves to be remembered. Tell me where you are listening from. And please, if this story has meant something to you, subscribe to this channel. I have many more stories to tell, and I would be honored to tell them to you. Until next time, take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. And remember that the hillsides are listening. They remember.